Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The governing logic behind all this, the TLOS purpose, is to break the power of the states. There's a very potent and sort of calculated reason behind invoking Jim Crow over and over again in all of this, because, we make these carve-outs. We've developed these carve-outs over time in our system for prohibiting the states from exercising the latitude granted them under our federal government to such an extent that they violate the eternal principles that are enshrined in those in our federal regime.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the Claremont Institute, or the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm Ryan Williams, your host, publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, and president of the Claremont Institute. I am joined, as always, the whole gang's back in the saddle. Matthew Peterson, Vice President of Education and founding editor of the American Mind. James Pullis, Executive Editor of the American Mind. Seth Barron, Managing Editor of the American Mind, and Spencer Clavin, Associate Editor of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. I have a bit of lead-in material today, and then we'll get after it. I wanted to open with this sort of interesting development of recent weeks about governors in red states and election integrity. It plays in a bit with governors in red states and their efforts to combat this trans rights problem, or the hysteria around transgender rights and sports and all that. But the voting one is very much on everyone's mind right now. So I just have I'm going to tie all these things together and with a bit of historical document, and then we can get after it. So the first piece I have is from the Washington Post. Headline is House Committee Approves D.C. Statehood, Setting Up Likely Passage in the Full Chamber. Just a few pieces from that. Once a fringe issue, granting statehood to the city that is D.C. has become a central part of the Democratic Party's voting rights platform. Skipping a few paragraphs. Like last year, the bill is likely to face significant hurdles in the Senate. Because of the filibuster, the legislation needs the support of 60 senators to advance. Democrats hold 50 seats in that chamber, and Vice President Harris, a statehood supporter, can cast tie-breaking votes. But not all Democratic senators have expressed support for the legislation. Advocates have framed statehood as both a voting rights and racial justice issue in the plurality black city, a message that activists have taken to voters as far away as Arizona and Alaska. It is time to right this 220-year-old wrong and finally end taxation without representation in Washington, D.C., said D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. We know that when Washington, D.C. becomes the 51st state, when we get a vote in the House and representation in the Senate, that will make our entire region stronger. At the oversight hearing Wednesday, so they had a committee hearing that reported it out. The House will vote on it soon. Republicans resorted to two main arguments against statehood, that it was a Democratic power grab and that it was unconstitutional. Democrats enlisted their resident constitutional law expert to rebut some of this. The committee's ranking Republican, James Comer from Kentucky, suggested that Democrats wanted statehood so they could prioritize defunding the police, packing the Supreme Court, and enacting the Green New Deal. Let's be very clear what H.R. 51 is about. It's all about creating 2 new Democratic Senate seats, he said, before name-dropping the nation's top Democrats and referring to a group of liberal members of Congress whom Republicans love to target. That would be the Squad, of course. Republicans offered numerous amendments. Representative Jody Hice from Georgia proposed returning D.C. residents the right to vote for members of the House and Senate if they voted as residents of Maryland. This amendment mirrored how voting worked in D.C. between 1790 and 1800, when D.C. residents could vote in federal elections as residents of either Virginia or Maryland, each of which had ceded land to create the capital city. Heiss, his reasoning on this was pretty good, or her reasoning on this was pretty good. But Jody, is that a he or her? Well, we'll see. Who cares? That system ended in 1801 when Congress stripped D.C. of its voting rights in federal elections and assumed full control of district affairs. Heiss argued that his amendment, would resolve the issue of taxation without representation. If H.R. 51 is not a power play for 2 more Democratic senators, Heiss said, then this proposal ought to be a satisfactory solution. Heiss's amendment failed, as did the others offered by GOP lawmakers. Another item, and I promise these are all tied together. First of its kind meeting draws more than 100 corporate leaders to discuss state voting laws. This was over the weekend. More than 100 of the nation's top corporate leaders met virtually on Saturday to discuss ways for companies to continue responding to the passage of more restrictive voting laws across the country, a signal that the nation's premier businesses are preparing a far more robust, organized response to the ongoing debate. Also related, this new group, the Civic Alliance, has this joint statement out. It's companies from Amazon to, all the ones you'd expect, to Uber, to Capital One, to Cisco, to various actually C3s in the foundation world, to GitHub, to H&M, et cetera, HP. You wouldn't be surprised. It's a lot of them. The joint statement that they have says that we believe every American should have a voice in our democracy and that voting should be safe and accessible to all voters. We stand in solidarity with voters and with the Black executives and leaders at the helm of this movement in our nonpartisan commitment to equality and democracy. If our government is going to work for all of us, each of us must have equal freedom to vote, and elections must reflect the will of voters. There are hundreds of bills threatening to make voting more difficult in dozens of states nationwide. We call on elected leaders in every state capital and in Congress to work across the aisle and ensure that every eligible American has the freedom to easily cast their ballot and participate fully in our democracy. One other piece from their Civic Alliance website has that our ambitious goal is 80% voter turnout. We may have a long way to go, but by working together, we will create a culture where civics matter and participation is a habit. So one of the two founding sort of funders of this Civic Alliance group is Democracy Works, which was a very close partner in the nonprofit network behind the vote by mail stuff last summer. You can find all this info at capitalresearch.org, which does good work on this. Just two more items. I have, so that was on Saturday, this group of folks releasing this statement. There's this organization, Civic Alliance, which is putting some real institutional heft behind it, some corporate collusion, if you will, against voting reforms in places like Georgia. And then on actually today, Wednesday, as we recorded, or earlier today before we started recording, you have this New York Times piece. Hundreds of companies unite to oppose voting limits, but others abstain. And notably, and I'll read what they took out a full page ad in the Washington Post and the New York Times called "We Stand for Democracy." I'll read those principles in a minute, but just in this New York Times piece, it's just to show the breadth of this. Across some states. As Michigan's Senate prepares to hold hearings on a package of voting bills, the chief executives of 30 of the state's largest companies, including Ford Motor, GM, Quicken Loans, released a joint statement on Tuesday declaring their opposition to changes in the state's election laws that would make voting more difficult. These are separate statements across the states. GM said on Twitter, "We're calling on Michigan lawmakers and state legislatures across the nation to ensure that any changes to voting laws result in protecting and enhancing the most precious element of democracy. Anything less falls short of our inclusion and social justice goals." In Texas, where two omnibus bills that would introduce voting restrictions are working their way through the legislature, more big companies reiterated their opposition to restrictive new voting laws. Hewlett-Packard, which is based in Houston, said in a statement, "We categorically oppose any legislation that unfairly seeks to restrict the right of our team members or any American to vote in fair, accessible, and secure elections." And in Arizona, activists and labor groups have begun calling on companies with large presences in the state, including CVS, Allstate, Farmers Insurance, and Enterprise Holdings, to publicly oppose legislation that could limit voting access. That official statement is short and it sounds pretty anodyne. It starts off with "a government of the people, by the people." A beautifully American ideal, but a reality denied to many for too much of the nation's history. As Americans, we know that in our democracy, we should not expect to agree on everything. However, regardless of our political affiliations, we believe the very foundation of our electoral process rests upon the ability of each of us to cast our ballots for the candidates of our choice. For American democracy to work for any of us, we must ensure the right to vote for all of us. We all should feel a responsibility to defend the right to vote and to oppose any discriminatory legislation or measures that restrict or prevent any eligible voter from having an equal and fair opportunity to cast a ballot. Voting is the lifeblood of our democracy, and we call upon all Americans to join us in taking a nonpartisan stand for this most basic and fundamental right of all Americans. So what's afoot with all of this? I mean, to the sort of outside, non-politically astute observer, it just looks like these companies are calling for a pretty benign thing, which is equal access to the vote. But the devil is in all these details. And continuing on a theme we've elaborated here at the American Mind and in writings in the CRB and some of our senior scholars' research, I mean, the real rub is in that language about discriminatory. We have a divided America. We live in many ways under two constitutions, with one side viewing human nature and rights one way and the other side viewing them another way. What's baked into a lot of this rhetoric, and from the corporations themselves, it's a lot of PR rhetoric. I don't think they even understand in any deep way what's really going on here, but the activists on the left certainly do, which is to say, for them, discrimination means any unequal outcome in voting. That is to say, any measure like requiring ID or requiring, an affidavit when you vote by mail, or restricting mail-in voting because of its higher incidence of fraud and thrown out things. Anything that would result in, as the left puts it, black or brown people having a higher rate of ballots thrown out or voting at lower rates. This whole notion of disparate impact, which we get from civil rights law over the last 40 years, has been freighted into voting stuff. So there's the top line rhetoric is very deceptive, and all these corporations are basically buying into it whole hog. It goes back to a court case from 90 years ago, which I won't quote at the moment, but maybe after we discuss a bit. But not is all as it seems in this voting rights debate, and it's an interesting game of chicken going on between state legislatures, corporations, and of course, we can't really trust the New York Times or the Washington Post, which I read from both, to do real justice to what's really going on here.
It is interesting that we get all of these things framed now, pre-framed in terms that have nothing to do with what the issues on the table are actually about. I mean, we talked about this last week a little bit, but voter ID laws have exactly zero to do with race. I mean, and the readiness with which people like Rashida Tlaib and others will just ascribe active intentionality. This is actually just a ploy on the part of Republicans who are sitting in their back rooms and rubbing their hands and saying, I know how I will deny black people the right to vote today. I mean, this is a remarkable feat, really, of rhetorical. I mean, it's of total institutional capture and total media capture. But even Republicans kind of, it seems to me, end up on the back foot here. I mean, I like the guy that called Jody, I forget his last name, the guy that called the bluff on DC statehood. But this, I think, is a function of the two constitutions' reality, that we are basically living, half of us are living in an America which strives imperfectly to live up to colorblind ideals of equality and justice before the law. And genuinely in our hearts have no real animus, racial animus that's expressed in any of our legal proceedings. And then half of us are living in this bizarro world where racism lurks around every corner, that is kind of inherently baked into the 1964 Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation. I mean, as I've now mentioned a couple times on the Substack podcast, Biden's ambassador to the UN came out today to say that our founding documents have structural racism, white supremacy woven into them. And it's not explicit, but it's kind of baked into the idea of anti-discrimination law, that freedom of association, for example, is a fundamentally racist thing, because it will sort of result in and just a discriminatory thing, full stop. And discrimination is bad because it means that people don't get all the same things all the time. I mean, that view of the world is now essentially taken as read in the debates that we're having. I mean, I feel that we're having the voter ID law debate, for example, within the context of just a predetermined assumption that the issue on the table when you talk about who gets to vote is race, and not what's the right way to conduct a free and fair election with people of any color. It's quite remarkable, and it's a good example of something that people can just reject out of hand by simply saying it's not even a question which voter ID laws are racist. It's a question of just denying the framework that this is even remotely that this involves race in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to view all this within the broader context of what that side of the aisle intends to do with democracy in America. This is a side that wants to pack the court. This is a side that has still not managed to discipline its anti-Senate wing. There's serious talk of canceling the Senate. This is a side that wants to make the District of Columbia a state, which it seems to me transparently is just a dry run for turning cities into states, for breaking the power of the states in the same way that the Senate is removing the Senate from the equation is designed to do, and to usher in an era of plebiscitary democracy. I mean, anyone can get 80, 85%, 90% support. This is why we all laughed at Saddam Hussein. They had regular elections, and every time he won. Plebiscitary democracy has been a source of comfort and amusement for authoritarians since the beginning. And the idea that simply because something is made more convenient, it is made better, or it is protected better, or honored more, is baseless, logically baseless. And we should not make voting as easy as possible, especially when the goal, again, is to federalize all acts of citizenship and to restrict them down to, you get a couple votes every couple of years for Congress. You get a big one every 4 years for president. And local associations are destroyed, and local government is stripped of its powers. And state governments who attempt to craft their own laws are punished by corporations and by the federal government. I mean, this is the context in which we need to see what's going on with voting law, and they're just getting started.
Yeah, and it's all wrapped up, of course, as anyone who's been paid attention to the president's remarks on this lately, in the history of the Jim Crow South. Biden keeps calling it new Jim Crow, which is absurd. The old Jim Crow, you had actual really restrictive processes that forbade or made it difficult to the point of impossibility, poll tests and the rest in the South for blacks to vote. We're nowhere near any of that. As I said, the thing that they have to fall back on is that somehow the outcomes are not equal in access to voting. That is to say, ID requirements or a whole slate of requirements, none of which are that onerous to prove that you're voting validly, happen to disproportionately fall on folks of a certain color is not presumptive, is not proof of some new Jim Crow. But I just wanted to trace this back to this old case. It's a little known case, but it actually accounts for the kind of bifurcated way in which we address rights in this country, and in the way in which we regulate them, the way in which courts treat them, and everything else. And you kind of see the germ of all this special treatment of especially voting rights in this case from 1938 called Caroline Products. Now, it's not a very glamorous case. It's a case about Congress's power to regulate milk. This has to do with the Filled Milk Act, which in which Congress deemed there's this species of skimmed milk that people were adding oils to, vegetable oils and the rest. It's a practice that happens today with all manner of vegan stuff, among other things. But Congress decided that ginning up milk or bulking it up with oils, vegetable oils of various sorts, was harmful to public health, so they prohibited it. Anyway, that's not the important part of this. The important part is the following in the bulk of the case, which again was from 1938. It says, regulatory legislation affecting ordinary commercial transactions is not to be pronounced unconstitutional unless, in the light of the facts made known or generally assumed, it is of such a character as to preclude the assumption that it rests upon some rational basis within the knowledge and experience of the legislators. That's judicial speak for stuff regulating commerce. We're going to basically presume that Congress is acting in good faith. If they provide some reason, we're fine with it. Now, this is the famous footnote 4 that came right after that sentence at the bottom of this. And this, in many ways, is a footnote that launched long before the Civil Rights Act sort of launched the predicate for our modern civil rights regime. The footnote says, there may be narrower scope for operation of the presumption of constitutionality when legislation appears on its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those of the first 10 amendments, which are deemed equally specific when held to be embraced within the 14th. That is, exercised against the states through the 14th. It is unnecessary to consider now whether legislation which restricts those political processes which can ordinarily be expected to bring about repeal of undesirable legislation is to be subjected to more exacting judicial scrutiny under the general prohibitions of the 14th Amendment than are most other types of legislation. Nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at particular religious or national or racial minorities, whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition which tends seriously to curtail the operation of those political processes ordinarily to be relied upon to protect minorities, and which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. That is the kind of judicial framework that in many ways was put on steroids by the provisions of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's why you have the courts over the last, 70, 90, almost 100 years in America kind of being perfectly happy to let Congress and state legislatures do whatever they like with property rights and economic interests, but nonetheless reserved to themselves, that is, to the courts, and now to a large portion of the civil rights bureaucracy, a more stringent view of voting stuff. And this makes a certain sense, right? It's embodied in that footnote. Look, if you restrict the vote, you restrict the ability of minorities of various kinds, whether they be racial or otherwise, to actually do anything in the political process that can help them protect themselves and vindicate their rights. There's a certain logic to that. But we're long past the real operation of any of our laws to this end. We're long past Jim Crow. But this notion that we've come this far on voting rights and on access to the voting box, basically anything that can be painted as a step backwards, even if it's benign and neutral, like requiring, ID, photo ID, official photo ID in order to vote, which most countries across the West especially consider to be perfectly fine, reasonable, and of course, rational. Any step back and you're dumped into this old history of both jurisprudence and civil rights bureaucracy. And that's how disingenuous politicians like Joe Biden can say with a certain plausibility to a bunch of interest groups and people who are sort of see a slide back into Jim Crow and back into bad democracy a la, pre-Civil Rights Amendment and back in the bad dark days of segregation. That's sort of all of this is freighted in this conversation, and most people just don't know any of this history, and so it just you can miss all of the tectonic forces that are vying against each other, and that's a bit of the jurisprudential history and reason for us butting heads in our cold civil war, as Angelo Codevilla called it, with really two constitutions operating. And it makes this debate over voting rights just very confusing to normal Americans.
Well, I think James really hit the nail on the head when he said that the governing logic behind all this, the TLOS purpose, is to break the power of the states. And it's worth noting in light of that very, very erudite tour through the jurisprudential history, Ryan, that there's a very potent and sort of calculated reason behind invoking Jim Crow over and over again in all of this, because, we make these carve-outs. We've developed these carve-outs over time in our system for prohibiting the states from exercising the latitude granted them under our federal government to such an extent that they violate the eternal principles that are enshrined in those in our federal regime. And Jim Crow and this, I mean, this is like in large part what the Civil War becomes about, both in the course of its conduct, but also in our national memory, right, and in Lincoln's eventual sort of assessment of it. And so now the sort of sleight of hand is that, well, in fact, any deviation from the accepted norms of the ruling classes constitutes a deviation beyond the pale, outside the Overton window of acceptable American conduct and discourse. And therefore, all the states must be brought to heel, not only via sort of legislative intervention, not only via radical reform and radical disfigurement of our voting system, but also with the full power of the corporate world, with every with every major sort of lobbyist in reverse that can be found to rally against states like Georgia. And we've already discussed on this podcast the extent to which that tactic is longstanding. That states are disciplined; they are brought to heel by the ruling classes, by every branch of the ruling class, whenever it is perceived that they are ready to show a little bit of fight against the dictates of that ruling class. And so now, I mean, it's reached a level of parity, except it reveals, as James articulated, it reveals the extent to which they want to clamp down on the entire nation, to reduce every individual within it to a sub-citizen role that is not to the role of active participant in a local and then a state and then a federal government, but to merely kind of interchangeable pawns and counters that they can tally up one after the other as they bust them to the polls and invite them and look over their shoulder as they cast a vote in name only for a candidate that represents them only in name.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's said so far. And in fact, I'm kind of taken aback by, I thought I was fairly radical in this. I hadn't even considered the idea that the goal of this is to turn the cities into states, but I think that makes sense. That's kind of what follows. It's so funny because, yes, why don't the Republicans just talk about this in terms of the sanctity of the vote? Exactly, the vote has sanctity, so why don't we preserve it? Why don't we make it enshrine it as a jewel and not cheapen it? Why isn't this cast in terms of keeping our democracy robust? But all of that is really just quaint. That's just quaint rhetoric. We're past that. The COVID lockdowns enabled the Democrats to get to push all of their entire agenda about voting. And it can't be put back. Every step back is like, it's like put a weasel in a trap that will, gut it as it tries to remove itself. So yeah, we're stuck. Regarding DC statehood, I mean, I was flabbergasted recently to discover that statehood, I had always assumed that achieving statehood requires, I don't know, if not the same level of approval as a constitutional amendment does, at least a supermajority in Congress. But no, it's just the same as passing a law. I read some person who hates the Senate wrote a thing saying what they need to do once the Democrats need to pass a law turning Washington, D.C. into 74 states or something, enough states that it would permanently destroy the Electoral College and turn everything, just democratize everything in that way. And they could do it. That's the amazing thing, is they really could do it. And I guess we always had an implicit understanding or a contract that we wouldn't do things like that. And the idea that Joe Manchin is walking around talking about how Robert Byrd counseled him not to ever let this filibuster go away, because I mean, this is like the 19th century still walking around, and the Democrats are just livid that they still have this fossil in their party who doesn't get it, that this is just a power play. Like, we have the power. Why aren't you letting us use it? It's so frustrating to them. Yeah, and finally, on the question of DC statehood, I mean, the Constitution very specifically says that the seat of the federal government should not be a state. And I think that's because, like, every state has, like, particular economic interests, and those are important. But the only economic interest of Washington, D.C. is perpetuation of the federal government and expansion of federal power. So if you turn it into a state, everyone there just depends on enhancing federal power. That's the industry. So it seems like it's just a major conflict of interest. I mean, it would be bad enough to, I guess, let those people vote in Maryland, but I mean, that would be fine. But I don't see that as satisfying them. So it seems like a bad situation all around.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before, but the real kind of seed rhetorically, I think here, two things that I want to talk about, two things that need to be done to get out of this, or to fight it at least. You can't get out of it. This is the reality we now face, and it's inexorable. We clear what they're going to do, and the stone is going to roll down the mountain. So what are we going to do about it? Well, first, as we've discussed, and as has been alluded to in this podcast, the Republicans need to break out of this ridiculous racial narrative frame and just call this out for what it is. You want 80% turnout. You want, Saddam Hussein's regime. If you want 80 to 90% of people to turn out, then you ignore all history of the human race, and you can have that kind of regime. Like, the kind of regime you will get is one in which you cajole and corral the poors and people who don't want to vote, otherwise would not vote. They easily could. They're not being suppressed, but they do not want to go out and vote. And you're going to have a central party in power, going out there. And that's what happens. People don't understand what this looks like. What this looks like is a bunch of partisan operatives, whether they call themselves neutral from an NGO or not, and they canvass neighborhoods and they just sign people up and basically cajole them into voting, right? That's what they're doing. You're just going out and harvesting votes. Now, the concept of citizenship that America was built on is not that. If you are not capable of taking the step to look around and care enough to take the steps to go vote, then you're not acting as a responsible citizen. You can make that choice. And in fact, we don't want you voting because probably you don't know how to vote, right? You don't have the knowledge. You don't know who to vote for. These are hard truths that used to not be hard, but just, basic to the concept of American citizenship or Republican citizenship. So what they're going to do is they're going to go out and corral people. And, that's what happened in the last election. I mean, Zuckerberg is giving money, right, to take over with a nonprofit that takes over the actual machinery of voting in Wisconsin. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent to canvass neighborhoods and to go out and harvest vote. It's among a lot of people. They tend to be poor. They could be of any color. It doesn't matter to anyone. The point is you're harvesting votes of people who otherwise are not taking the steps to do so. And when you do that, you have entered Soviet territory. That is exactly, as James said, how all these regimes work. So 80, 90% voting is normally a warning sign in any kind of healthy Republican regime that has a very wide notion of suffrage. So how do you counter that? I mean, we have to directly address this. We have to directly say, this is not actually a healthy democracy. What you want to do is not a good thing, and here's what it looks like. And find rhetorical ways to explain that in simple language to the American people and just blow past this racial garbage. And second, this notion of the states fighting, right? People should think back to the run up to the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War actually starts because the South realizes that they're losing the federal government and there's a race on to create new states. Well, what does the left want to do? They're thinking about creating new states. They're thinking about changing the structure of government, changing how many people are on the Supreme Court, because they are worried about a resistance after Trump showed real resistance to them, unlike a kind of fake right in the previous 20 years. And they want to end this, right? They want to end it. They want to create a one-party state. So what do you do when you have this race? Well, we need to be in the race. Republicans should be saying, the real counter is, yeah, by all means, explain, Washington, D.C., this isn't even constitutional. This doesn't make any sense. What you guys want to do is just shameless partisanship. Okay, yeah, that's fine. On the other end of it, we should say, you know what? You're kind of right. City states might be a good idea. And that's also why the rest of New York State should be 3 additional states, right? I mean, California should be broken up. We actually have people who can crunch numbers on that. Let's do that. Right? Let's make 3 states out of rural California, and you can make 2 states out of San Francisco and LA. Let's do it. I mean, I would say there's a whole lot of benefit to say, yeah, there's all kinds of ways that America, as it's presently drawn, doesn't make sense. And you want to play the game of adding states, that's a great idea. Western New York and Western Pennsylvania obviously are very different than New York City. Those people live in District 12 and they have to drive into the capital and see it oppress them. They should have their own state. Pittsburgh can be the capital. Let's make it happen. Let's do it. Let's have a deal. You have to put opposing pressure that's positive on them and come up with ideas along those lines, at least, because that's the game they're playing. And until we start really pushing like that, you have leaders who are really pushing like that on the right. You might be able to tamp some of this down that way, but regardless, you're not going to win unless there's really bold, proactive proposals that play some jujitsu with what they're tinkering with. And what they're tinkering with is the very fabric of the American regime.
Yeah, and it allows, I think that's right, Matt. I mean, it would be good to use this as an opportunity in the ways that you present. And also, I will note, too, that it was not quite put in the form that you put it, in the sense of, but as you said, we've talked about it here before. Democracy is not a good in its own right. Republicanism is, for a variety of reasons, but mere democracy is only as good as the ends it produces, the purposes it advances, and the principles it rests on. So a mere high turnout is not something to be applauded in and of itself, although some threshold of participation is kind of a prerequisite for any functioning democracy. It's certainly well south of 80%. But you see, I saw Jonathan Last, the other day in a Bulwark op-ed, kind of poo-pooing this latest development on the right and scoffing at it as a leftist would, which is to say, now the Trumpy right, as he would put it, he didn't quite put it in that way. Now they're running down democracy too, and sort of caught up in that statement is an assumption that you just rightfully put down, and it's something you wouldn't expect out of a right-wing publication. I suppose maybe the Bulwark is now not a right-wing publication and really never was. So we shouldn't be surprised, given the certain shifts on the right, that they're making common cause with lazy arguments that used to be more expected on the left. I just wanted this one last pretty revealing quote from, and it's something for us to ponder how much the corporate execs involved in this are just tools. Not sort of personally, although they may be that, but just they're tools of this larger argument and tools of the kind of center-left consensus on this issue, which is being tugged ever leftward by the real left and shifting the center to the left. And it's sort of encapsulated in this. So 2 of the leading guys for this Wednesday statement, I know there have been a bunch of them, but the one from today, one of them was this guy, Kenneth Chenot, who is I don't know if he looks like a French last name, but former chief executive of American Express, and then Kenneth Frazier, the chief executive of Merck. And both of them said something along the following, and it was embodied in that quote that I recited from their full-page ad. But in this New York Times piece, or one of them, Chennault said, "It should be clear that there's overwhelming support in corporate America for the principle of voting rights. We are not being prescriptive," he said. "There's no one answer." Mr. Fraser emphasized that the statement was intended to be nonpartisan, arguing that protecting voting rights should garner support from Republicans and Democrats alike. "These are not political issues," he said. "These are the issues that we were taught in civics." And you can see encapsulated in that sort of glib or very general statement all that stuff that was in footnote 4 of Caroline Products that I ran through, which, they're not conscious of it, but what civil rights and voting rights has come to mean on the left is kind of a mix of equal results for discrete and insular minorities in any field, including voting rights, which means if you put otherwise neutral principles in place that lead to a disproportionate impact, even if it's through individual behavior and no malice from anyone, if it leads to unequal outcomes, including in voting participation, it's per se a violation of voting rights. And so that's why these guys can think this is nonpartisan, this is not a political issue, we're just talking about the principle of voting rights, when half of America is kind of left scratching their heads. The fundamental divide is over the nature of rights, and it's wrapped up in this civil rights regime that's sort of grown on top of our old constitutional order. And so I just wanted to emphasize that point for now the third time, because it cannot be emphasized enough, the different languages we're all speaking on these issues. And it leads to, I think, for charitable participants in this and non-malicious ones, it leads to a talking past one another and a difficulty to believe that the other side is arguing in good faith. And it's one of the many reasons why we have such a high volume, or not volume, but high temperature divide in these sorts of arguments around what are thought to be the baselines of democracy or republicanism.
Well, and just to push this thing even a little bit farther is, if you then take seriously the claims of everyone from Biden's new UN ambassador to your run-of-the-mill woke commissar spread throughout corporate America or academia, every white vote is inherently suspect, right? At a minimum, because white supremacy is woven into all of our institutions, and because even people who walk around thinking that they're not racist are still propagating structural racism and are still in the grip of implicit bias. I don't know what the CEO of Amex learned in his civics class, but one thing that he could have learned if he studied a little history of political thought is that the obsession with mastering what Rousseau called the general will by achieving some kind of perfect knowledge of the general will has been around probably even longer than Rousseau, and now it's coming back with a vengeance. The only way that social justice can really be tried is by creating a social credit system that is, ultimately run on some kind of supercomputer that can determine, what every single person wants and what every single person deserves at every minute of every day. It's always on, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just like any computer server, constantly processing the data, constantly running the analysis, and constantly determining, a microaggression happened here, it needs to be offset in this way. If we're all on UBI, those numbers are going up and down, just like the price of Bitcoin. And the tantalizing prospect that a social justice, social credit system can perfectly know and perfectly master the general will is where we are being aimed by people who really think that achieving some kind of absolute democracy is an absolute good or an absolute progress. There is no inherent logical stopping point once you start getting into the business of, well, the easier it gets to vote, the more often people vote, the more that we're aware of what people want and when they want it. That's the direction this pushes in. Democracy is not an unalloyed good. We've known this from the beginning of Western civilization. And the more tools that technology give people who want to be masters of the whole, the harder they'll try to create a database that supposedly contains the knowledge of the multitude of the general will, and the harder they will work to, in their minds, perfect a political science that is organized not around our system of government, but around capturing the consciousness of the general will, instant by instant, and using it to reinforce their power.
Can we just explain real quick? I mean, I don't know, if you're listening, I don't know. I mean, through no fault of your own, you might be like, what are you talking about? Why is democracy bad? Or you might think, we mean democracy is bad because sometimes people vote the wrong way. I think there's a real deep truth and a deep problem here, which is that, pure democracy, as Aristotle says, doesn't have representation at all. So we think democracy means you vote for someone who represents you and then they go to an assembly. But what Aristotle says is that representation or Republican government is based on this principle is actually an aristocratic element of government. And the reason why is this: if it's a pure democracy and we're all purely equal, then we should just rule by lots, like just have a random lottery and anyone can rule. We just take turns going into office because after all, we're all perfectly equal. And the idea of representation brings in with it, well, who actually has the qualifications to govern? And all of a sudden it brings in a standard of excellence that wasn't there before. And so when we're more democratic, right, our more democratic tendencies are to say, well, I want someone who looks like me, who thinks like me, and is exactly like me. But like I used to say to students all the time, okay, because this is what they would say in class. Well, of course, I want someone who looks like me, talks like me, and is just like me, and represents everyone in that way, and just represents them, and anyone could do it. And then you say, okay, so you really want the average SAT score, you want the average person in the class, you want to take the average person in your neighborhood and just randomly put them in charge, or do you still want something who actually knows a lot more than you and has skills that are better than you to represent you? And of course, they all do the double take. That tension is always there in the American Republic. But the notion that, a pure democracy is always a sham. It's always a lie, because you can't actually have a mass of people governing themselves. You're going to have a small group. And so this is hardwired, right, deep into this problem. And this is exactly right. I mean, what happens when you when you pretend that the mass or the group of everybody can rule in some kind of pure democratic way, which the founders were very much against, which is why we have the Constitution we do and why we're still around, it is because you actually make something very elite. So the larger the mass of people that are involved, the more that it's necessary for a small group to rule things. And this naturally happens. It's why YouTube is the only site on the internet that everyone has to be on for video, even though anyone can technically make video. You atomize and equalize things. You atomize and equalize the mass, and it's almost like a mathematical principle. You make the need for this elite thing to rise. And that's what they're going to do, right? You get voting up to 80, 90%, and they're all voting the same way. And then, of course, it'll be like, no, you all voted for the priests who run the machine James just talked about. You all support it. Every year you go out and you vote for the priests that run the machine, and the gods are happy, and it's going to automatically make us all equal. And of course, this is just a story of civilization and politics. The more you say that, the more the red flags go up, because what is happening is actually you're creating something that is oligarchic, aristocratic, and ultimately just tyrannical in ways that really become demonic. I mean, they really become destructive of the human soul.
It's worth noting, mostly, Matt, as a gloss on that, that this notion of the general will, the closer it gets to being, instantiated in actual fact, the more it becomes clear that the general will never actually reflects any individual will, or at least it only reflects like a very few individual wills. So if you have a so-called general will with which the majority of people, if they were honest and went by their common sense, are unhappy, then something's not computing, right? And what's not computing is that, of course, there is no such thing, right? I mean, somebody is making choices about which desires count and which individual systems of values should be incorporated into that master computer, right? The master computer functions according to an algorithm. And as our woke friends would be happy to point out in another context, right? Like somebody's writing that algorithm. That algorithm is selecting and choosing certain things that matter about people's ideas. And so it would be probably better if the person doing that selecting and choosing were a very wise, prudent statesman, or a series of wise, prudent statesmen who were elected and chosen by the people to represent them, right? I mean, like as Matt is saying, if what you're doing instead is just imagining that some kind of neutral arbiter can extract from each individual an input into a vast calculation that then spits out the outcome that is going to be reflective of, the very best, the optimal outcome that everybody kind of wants, you're going to find, of course, that nobody actually wants the thing that's going on. I mean, an excellent example of this would be like, we are currently on issues like gender, for example, operating according to principles that nobody really believes in or desires, like the men can become women, or there's no such thing as gender, right? All of these things are believed in true blue belief, in deep, heart level conviction by a vanishingly small number of people. And then there's a bunch of other people that want to virtue signal or feel afraid or whatever, or contribute their one token of assent to that so-called general will, and you end up with this thing that like looks like the kind of just there's a general consensus in the air that people are questioning ideas about gender, and of course everybody is thinking in his heart, this makes no sense, this makes me miserable, this is sort of this makes me want to destroy myself and others, and you can pass that off for a very long time as if it were this sort of Rousseauian abstract. Well, nobody chose this; it just came into being, and the purity of our hearts together. It's disastrous, as you say.
You're so wrong. I mean, because the equity algorithm is going to be neutral. The equity algorithm won't have hate in its heart, and the equity algorithm and the experts who run it, they will love us and they will serve us, and it will be wonderful.
What's funny, Matt, is like so much of this is explicit in the work of Ibram X. Kendi, right? I mean, we've been talking about he's basically just giving voice to the implicit premises of a lot of the sort of capital P progressive stuff we've all been talking about. But like this thing, his infamous dictum that there is no disparity in outcome that has any other explanation other than race, or that we could have a council of anti-racist people staffed by, quote, no political appointees, end quote, right? I mean, that is a lot of the stuff that you're saying is not like parody. It's just it's in that book.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear. I mean, James, I think that exactly that what Kendi says lends itself to the illusion of the AI, the illusion of, it's basically the idol, right? That's the God, and it gives you cover. And you'll say, well, no, this is something that can actually judge it, because after all, whiteness exists in every human heart. Or, I mean, for Kendi, it's more simple though. Right now, it's simply you can't be political because it's just woke people of color like him who will just judge things with their own prudence to create equity. But you could see the compromise going in this direction where you have these formulas, and I mean, I don't think we've even begun to be entranced by the power of what they're developing just in general, this technology and what it can calculate. And so there'll be the typical human awe for it, and then you can easily see how it would be used in this way.
Let me ask something, just as maybe it's a playing devil's advocate or something. Australia has mandatory voting, so they approach 100% voting turnout. Now, I'm not saying that Australia is like any model, and I guess it's not really Republican. But they haven't, and they have all the same kinds of, probably worse wokest sort of tendencies. Yet, I mean, they still more or less resemble an Anglo-American, rule of law. So, what do you? I mean, how do you respond to that? If you want to.
Well, one potential, I mean,
they are on the other side of the world, Seth. So, I mean, I don't really know if the laws of nature apply down there, but
they're upside down, as you all know. I mean, they walk upside down.
Sure.
I mean, I actually don't know that much about the minutia of Australian politics, but in general, with these questions, one obvious difference, or big difference, I should say, between us and other countries like Australia is the extreme difference in homogeneity, right? I mean, this is like Madison's whole thing about the extended republic, that we exist the only way for us to function in a truly representative government that deserves the name, the adjective free, is for us to be forced into these kind of momentary coalitions with our neighbors where we make compromises with one another and we genuinely protect the rights of minorities of all kinds. It was my experience in Britain, which was a country physically much smaller than Australia, and with a much smaller population than America. It was my experience that set of concerns was much less operative, because you could have such a thing as like a play that everybody in the country basically was talking about and had seen, or at least everybody in the major urban centers. And these sort of like highly homogenized smaller nations, I think it's fair to say, operate according to very, very different principles, where things like referenda and plebiscitary government still wouldn't be what I would want to sign up for, but they also don't make as much they don't cause as much inherent trouble as they would in America.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, two things. One is we do have to reckon with the size problem of what Spencer's talking about. But it is a good example, and it's a good counterpoint for sure. But I would, humbly submit, without being an expert, but knowing a little bit about their politics, that I think the trajectory of that country is has moved in. First off, they had a very homogenous population. They're an island, for God's sakes. I mean, it's even more than the Scandinavian countries in some ways, but they've moved in one direction, right? So it's a good counterexample in terms of form of government. You wouldn't say that they're a completely totalitarian regime or something like this, but I mean, they're at least as bad as Canada, right? And it's really bad there for any kind of conservatism. What they call the Conservative Party would be unrecognizable in America. And as far as their regime goes, the ship has sailed for what you'd call conservatism here. So I do think they're beyond the horizon politically in what, if you translate between the parties, is functionally a one-party state for us, even though they have really just two major parties fighting each other. So I don't see them as quite comparable. I think the fact that we don't have a longstanding homogenous population like them and are an island far away from everyone else, that certainly plays into it. It's enabled them to keep something like a democratic form of government for sure, but the kinds of choices on offer in Australia, when it comes to major political parties and politicians, I think are just very limited compared to what we have here.
10 million fewer people than California live in Australia.
I figured that was something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. UK is about 65 million. Australia about 25. And that's not a complete answer to you at all, Seth.
Yeah, that doesn't completely answer his objection to the size question, because he could say, well, we were talking about a political principle, right, that involves very small city-states. So that's fair.
Yeah, it's less, I think, a question of raw size than of cultural homogeneity or lack thereof, right? I mean, this is part of the whole thing about America is as a response to like Montesquieu and all of this, not to rehearse the civics that apparently our corporate overlords didn't really grok in school, but like the whole situation is like we're big in territory, we're big in size, and we like notionally at least can accommodate multiple subcultures.
Let me actually say, I mean, I'm a little dense, it's late at night. Let me actually say, I think the real answer to that is even, I don't even think it's so much cultural homogeneity or that plays a part for sure. I think it's the fact that Australia is one of these countries where they don't have the stratification that we do, right? So they, in a sense, it's a lot easier for them to maintain the form of government, because it's not like Russia was at various times had some amount of cultural homogeneity, but even if you just looked at not the whole Soviet Empire, but just say Russia. So what the problem is when you have the stratification, I think we have more inequality, as people would say, than Australia does, and I think that causes some of the problem as well, and the difference. In any event, I would say this: I think that's a great, fair point, and it's a counter that probably if we worked on, we'd discover a lot of cool distinctions and truths. But I do think it's also anomalous.
Well, one thing about Australia is, it is known as the lucky country. They're just blessed. Yes, it's an island. They have tremendous natural resources. And they also have a stronger sense of the necessity of preserving the integrity of their borders. Australia they would set up billboards around South Asia, like Afghanistan, places like that. And they would put up billboards that said, if you enter Australia illegally, you will never settle in Australia. In Indonesia, places like that. And then what they did is they arranged with Papua New Guinea to put all of their internment camps for illegal aliens, like people trying to get in by boat. So they stick all these people in Papua New Guinea who then, like the worst place in the world. And these people in these camps, I'm not saying this to make it like it's like a great thing to do, but they're going so crazy there. They're like, please let us go back to Afghanistan. Please send us back to Iran. We cannot stand being in Papua New Guinea. So, all I'm saying is that there's still a consensus in Australia that you can't just throw open the doors to the world. This is the way that people here, there does seem to be a fairly strong element in the Democratic Party that, yes, open borders is fine. We should open the borders. So I'd say that's another difference that qualifies like my question.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Well, producer Jake says we have a minute left, so we've covered one topic, but it was a good one.
A rich topic.
Yeah, it was a rich topic. We'll have to put off for next week. We teased last week that we would do this sort of survey of the various factions on the right and the institutions and everything. We were going to start with just a waterfront view of all of it. It's a big topic, though, so I think we're going to work on it a bit, and we can start into that next week. I also it might still be fresh, but I just commend everyone's attention. Maybe we'll talk about it next week. It's a rich topic, but this guest column that Barry Weiss published on her Substack by a teacher at Grace Church High School in Manhattan. It's called "I Refuse to Stand By While My Students Are Indoctrinated," a theme we've been taking up a lot these days on this podcast, which is the sort of mad, crazy racialism and critical race theory spread across our campuses, both elementary and at higher education. And then this wonderful little piece from Chris Ruffo in City Journal called "Merchants of Revolution." Both those are worth your time. Chris just sort of has this, we've mentioned it on here before, he's become a receptacle for leaked documents. And he got one from Santa Clara County in California, which is up in the greater Bay Area, about their implementation and their plan for their local implementation of the new ethnic studies model curriculum that the state is now requiring across the K through 12 system, which, in Santa Clara, they'll respond very differently than they will over in the Central Valley. So those two things are pretty darn interesting. They'll be grist for our mill next week, I think, unless some other meteor comes across our way, and we will take up this question of the conservative movement as well. So thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and the Washington, D.C. Center site, dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee, the production and engineering crew. And thank you to all of you. Talk to you next week.